You're listening to VerySpatial Podcast, episode 719, August 6th, 2023.
Hello and welcome to our VerySpatial Podcast. I'm Jesse.
I'm Sue.
This is Barb.
And I'm Frank.
And this week we're going to be talking about dashboards. But first,
Three news items. First up in the news, I thought this was kind of cool. For those of a certain age, you'll remember, or if you're a Star Trek fanatic, the Voyager satellites that went out into deep space. There's Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. Recently, Voyager 2 kind of went offline. Like it just stopped talking. Apparently what happened is it turned itself, for unknown reasons, or at least I didn't see it in the news item, off axis, so it couldn't communicate with Earth anymore. And so we sent a ping out to say, hey, dude, pay attention. Essentially, they call it a shout, and got Voyager 2 to ride itself again. But it's kind of neat because it's the second furthest thing. Voyager 1, I think, is the furthest thing, but the second furthest thing that we've ever sent as a species out into the beyond the solar system at this point. And I think it's kind of neat that we can still communicate with it. And on the one hand, one of the things the news item points out is that it took 37 hours round trip for the communication to go out there and to get back. On the other hand, I think it's kind of neat that it only took 37 hours for the communication to go out there and get back. I mean, in a very real sense, I think we have people alive today, maybe not, but certainly whose grandparents or great-grandparents were much more used to communications taking longer than 37 hours. So the fact that we can reach something that's beyond our solar system in 37 hours and get a response back is kind of neat and astounding.
Yeah, I was looking in 1977, is that right, for the launch of Voyager 1 and 2? And so we were around for that, but so many people are not. And I mean, the best part is I kind of had forgotten that they were still out there, but that once they recommunicated, right, it's still, the Voyager 2 is still sending back data after all this time and so far away. It's so cool. And again, another, for me, amazing mission from NASA and from everybody involved, just the things that we've been able to learn and find out because of all that work.
Could you imagine somebody handed you a floppy from 46 years ago, which existed 46 years ago, and say, hey, can you get this file off of it? I mean, you don't even know where to start for getting data back. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It was the tech support response of not turn it on and off again, but just, hey, and went, yeah, okay, I'm here.
Next up in the news, this is, I thought, an interesting news item, considering we've just gone through in July, the hottest July and the hottest days on record since we've been started, calculating these things. I thought this was an interesting discussion, a little bit about some of the climate science stuff that's going on here. A weird phenomena has happened, a kind of an unexpected phenomena has happened. Despite the fact that we've had the hottest surface temperatures for oceans, the Atlantic in particular, we actually didn't have that many hurricanes in July, which is a little unexpected because, broadly speaking, you would expect that the hotter the water is, the easier it is to form a hurricane. But it turns out there's a much more complicated set of factors going on here. And I think it's one of the important things for us to remember when we think about climate science. It's a very complicated engine with a lot of moving parts. And even though occasionally people want to boil it down to, well, this little phenomena wasn't explained by your model, so it's a crap model. It's important to understand there's a lot of moving parts. And the neat thing to me in terms of Earth science, the reason we haven't had this many hurricanes is because the wind shear that goes on in the atmosphere. So basically, you need a combination of sufficiently slow atmospheric winds, which are happening at well above, the Earth. It's in the atmosphere, but it's way up there. It has to go slow enough, combined with warm enough surface temperatures, and the fact that we're in El Nino means you need to have less water pressure pushing down, so that's the perfect, no pun intended, perfect storm for formulating a hurricane. Well, it turns out two of those factors are kind of wonky in July, which is why we don't, despite having really above average ocean temperatures for July, have not seen that much of a hurricane formation. And I think that's just a neat news item to communicate to people that, hey, there's a lot more complexity going on here, and we have to understand this system is very intricate and interwound. And even though you pull on one string, it doesn't automatically mean there's going to be effect.
Yeah, and I think too, and another factor that comes into play that isn't mentioned here, but also often helps either fuel if there's not a lot of it, or suppress storms, is Saharan dust. So things that cycle in the atmosphere also come into play. But yeah, it's one of those things too, as pointed out. If the sheer other factors lessen and we do get storms, that'll be the interesting thing to see what the extra high temperatures might do to intensity, right? To the characteristics of the storms, if and when they do form.
Yeah, the really frightening thing here is that we don't really know what's going to happen in August or September, which is traditionally whenever hurricane season's, full on. And our South Carolina contingent will be much more familiar with this than the West Virginia contingent. But the kind of fear here is that we've got a taunt rubber band for one dimension, which is ocean temperatures. What happens if we kind of release or lessen some of these other rubber bands, and is that going to spring and cause havoc? We don't know, but it is an interesting interplay of forces.
Kind of an interesting side note, which don't have in the show notes yet. I'll make sure to link it. I just forgot which Green brother it was. He did a video about basically how in 2020 seabound traffic was regulated in terms of the type of fuels that they could use. And so a lot of the sulfur in the fuels was dropped. And so therefore these kind of contrails at the ground level that they've been creating because of the exhaust of sulfur dioxide have lessened. And because of that, there's fewer clouds. And so there's current evidence and theory to go along with it now that this lessened amount of clouds is helping to increase the temperatures. So that's kind of if you don't follow the Blog Brothers, definitely.
It's well worth a follow.
Yeah. All of their different things. Because it's all about science, right?
Yes.
Well, science and data, sort of like the new report that's out from the Committee on National Statistics, part of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine. They released the report that outlines what they think of as needed for the modernization of the U.S. national data infrastructure. What's really interesting to me is the U.S. Census Bureau, which was part of the data that's used, came out and basically said throughout all this, you could say geography is the infrastructure of the national infrastructure when you look at what the goals are for modernization. So I thought that was relevant to a lot of what we talk about, which is there's spatial embedded throughout everything, especially when you're talking about interoperability and use of data for a infrastructure, that all infrastructure is a spatial infrastructure.
Which actually leads nicely into our topic this week. So that's it for the news. What I had this idea. Okay, so let me back up and talk a little bit about what I've been doing since I've left explicitly GIS field. Is I've been involved in doing a lot of data analysis and data representation for an institution, a higher education institution, and to sort of analyze what is going on in that particular institution in terms of education and students and recruitment and you name it. And dashboards have become basically my everyday existence. At some point, we're coming up with ways of representing all these streams of data that we have in the institution, but also representing some of the streams of data that are around pools of data that are like national data sets, census, something called IPEDS, which I forgot what it stands for, but basically it's educational system data for the United States, and even looking at some international bits. And we use dashboards to represent this wealth of data. And it got me thinking a little bit about dashboards as a visualization technique and as a philosophical technique. So if you're not familiar with dashboards, and I can't imagine many listeners are not familiar with dashboards because they're all over the place, but essentially think of it like the dashboard of a car. You've got all these bits of information that are being fed to you, and you sort of hang them together into one display, and the different bits of information are represented using whatever technique that makes sense for the data. Most often it's numeric data, and most often it's some form of graph, occasionally with a table or something like that. And I think we've seen dashboards explode in the last, I don't know what, 5 years, 10 years, something like that they've sort of come into massive vogue. And I was thinking, a lot of the things that I end up representing in my day-to-day job now are geographic. And more often than not, they get represented by other people. Some of my colleagues, some of them are people in industry, as a graph. And it made me think of the quantitative debates that happened within geography going back to the late 50s, early 60s, and even into the GS and society debates. And I was kind of wondering, well, what's the next thing beyond dashboards? How do we visualize this complicated data, not as a number, not as a graduation rate or student ACT score or something like that? How do we represent that as something that's a little more deep and viable and extensible and connected to all this wealth of qualitative information that we have? And so I just wanted to kick off kind of a conversation about that and think about, well, dashboards have a place, but how do we move beyond them, and what would that look like moving forward?
Well, I want to keep contextualizing dashboards real quick.
Okay.
That what are we using them for? And, that's an example of one. We've, of course, seen ones that are spatial, like the Johns Hopkins that we talk about all the time. For a lot of industries, it's about Tableau. Some it's about ArcGIS dashboards and insights. Some it's some of the open source, where you're putting together different pieces, and then on the back end, of course, pulling through from R or one of the open source stats or spatial packages. So there's a lot of different ways that we can make them right now, but it's, a lot of it kind of hangs, I think, on Tableau. I think a lot of the industry is leaning that way. Is that what you guys use?
No, actually,
we mostly Power BI.
Power BI, which, if you're not familiar with Power BI, and I was not until I took this job, it's a tool set. And what I'm saying is Power B as in business, I as intelligence. That's what its name comes from. And it's embedded in the philosophies and approaches in business intelligence. It's kind of like Excel on steroids, the only way I can really describe it. But it is very much closer to an Excel type of understanding of information, the way they approach it. I've actually not used Tableau, so I don't know how it works functionally. I've just used dashboards that were built in Tableau.
And the big thing is that the user, not the Frank, not the us, not the whoever is creating it, but the user, it's more or less a static representation. They can be dynamic. They are updating a lot of times, so there is often some access to real-time data, but not always. Sometimes it's static data as well. And so, to go along with the business intelligence, you also get them kind of spun out there as location intelligence, and I think I've been seeing that term more.
Yeah.
It was big about a decade ago from the people who made Map Info. They got bought by Pitney Bowes, and I can't remember the name anymore right now. But it's buried back there. And back. This idea of location intelligence is just that. It's kind of a business veneer on statistics, especially spatial statistics.
Yeah, it kind of looks like. Hopefully, Jesse won't groan too much when I say this. It seems like the statistical version of deep maps, where the idea behind deep maps is that we take information about a location and we just fill it with as much information as humanly possible. But it tends to be, in the case of dashboards and location intelligence, the statistical bits of information, which doesn't necessarily have the thicker descriptions and stories and narratives that are associated with it.
I'll agree with you that it's kind of like that, especially in the fact that in both cases, both the user and the creator aren't really sure what they're going for.
That's true.
As it is with deep maps.
Pile it on there until you've got a thing, and they go, yeah, that's
deep maps. Yeah, sure.
That's it.
Well, and I think that's an important thing, right? Is that in looking at this, we have to say, so what is the dashboard supposed to do for the user, right? And so what is the creator adding to it to try to solve a problem. And so the dashboard idea, right, comes out of the whole situational awareness, right? If I'm going to make decisions, if I'm going to solve something, I need information, and I need to see it across the wide range of things. I can't do it maybe the old style where, I get a briefing on this and then a briefing on this, and then I have to write, somebody has to write me a report, something like that. Is that you can see it and feel like you're making an informed decision, or you're solving something that if I could just have more information, right, and see it all in one place, that I can do that. And so, I mean, would you agree, or would you add to the kind of the purpose of a dashboard? Because to go beyond it, you have to say, well, what's it supposed to be doing in the first place?
When I see it, though, it's also very much, again, out of business intelligence, or out of where I came out of competitive intelligence, with this idea of like you said, a war room with the, monitor with all the information you could have. But also for me, it feels very media, very contained. Like it's all the information you want, but it's not everything you need. It's very bounded. So you're not asking yourself what's not in here that shouldn't be in here, or what's, like Frank's asking, what's beyond the dashboard.
Well, I think to both your points, essentially what it relies upon is that if I give you enough data points, you can interpolate the necessary knowledge that you need. And that may not be the knowledge that I need, and that may not be the knowledge this other person needs. So this notion that I give you all the bits of information, you infer the important parts and make decisions based upon that. That's kind of the approach, that your brain is the analytical engine from a lot of this. And I think that's kind of, I don't think it's the end goal, but I think it's powerful in a lot of ways to say, oh, let's let you, the user, infer the important pieces of information.
I agree with all of you that is the altruistic way of looking at it. But I think a few of the different things that each of you said kind of highlight the fact that in reality, it's there to take place of the report, and you're just throwing stuff in there so you can get it out there and do less work to keep writing reports. So this is constantly updating. I don't have to keep writing a report. So just keep looking at this pretty data.
Well, I agree with Jesse in that what's missing is, for the spatial thing, it would be, where's the spatial analysis that you would get through the report that basically takes the stand? That there's so much background knowledge it requires a lot more local knowledge to use correctly, that we're making the assumption that our audience has that knowledge to make those decisions the same way we would.
Well, and I think that to me, it's, and I think I wouldn't necessarily think it's a conscious that I want to do less work, that maybe, Jesse, I would modify that in the sense that a user might not know what should be the next step, right? And
I'm talking about the people who are creating them.
Well, maybe the people creating it, but even then, I mean, they're just like, I'm just getting this to you. But it's a change in how we make decisions, right? Very much more in the moment. And I see this a lot, right? And I'm not a statistician. I've had my statistics. I do a lot of qualitative work, so I don't necessarily do a lot with statistics in my day job or have in the past. But it often seems now that we see a lot of decisions, and Frank, you're probably finding this in your job, right? I know that when I see the use of statistics in my day job, right, is that you'll see now, like when they see information coming at them in things, like a dashboard, and we'll start making decisions. But then, those who are statisticians will say, wait a minute, yes, in this last 4 months semester, you saw this, but that was literally a snapshot of what may or may not even be a trend, right? It might be an anomaly. And how will you know if you don't have that? So, seeing all this information and saying, I have to react to this in that short-term situational awareness, I think that the dashboard kind of maybe enhances that effect. Because on the one hand, you do want to see things as they're changing in the moment, or a shorter time frame. But on the other hand, without what comes before that, it's difficult to characterize it. And I think that's what I see in using dashboards, is that it's difficult to truly contextualize what you're seeing unless you have, some, as you're saying, Barb, some expertise or some analysis that's, going into that. So that's one of the things about dashboards that I guess is difficult to grasp, like how people are actually able to use them.
I think to Jesse's point, the report side of things, right? I mean, essentially what a report does, it says, this is what the data is, but this is why you're seeing this data. This is why we think you're seeing this data. This is what we believe is the overall effect that's going on here. And when you just look at the raw data, you're assuming that the person that's consuming that dashboard has the philosophical basis to draw those conclusions, to look at the data and say, yeah, but you got to mitigate this by this factor, that factor, this other factor, and understand that is going on. And I don't think that that's a valid assumption in my experience. An awful lot of the people that I see looking at these dashboards, I find I'm going, okay, let me explain this to you. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if I'm just explaining it, why don't I just write a stupid report? Why don't I just, that way I can explain it and then it's documented and you can always refer to it. So I find the dashboard a fascinating tool because it does allow for the immediacy and you can't see it because it's an audio medium, but when we say real time, we're putting air quotes because it could be, midnight that it gets updated. It's once a day, once a quarter, once a month. It's not real time in any sense that, what's the temperature right this second type of real time, but it is immediate data updates. But the other problem I have with them is the dashboards almost universally get down to numeric data. And so if you can't represent it using a number, it just kind of doesn't get represented. And that's going to, as we know from our, quantitative revolution debates and the GS and society debates within geography, we know that's going to preference certain outcomes or understandings of the world for good or bad. And I think that that's one of the things that has led me to sort of ask the question, what's the next thing beyond a dashboard that allows us to get back to some of this less, is it a number type of data or knowledge?
Well, we can point to things like Weather Underground or other weather-based dashboards, right? Where we have this very long history of here's the information in terms of numerical. We've now added dashboard with graphical, but they also provide contextual documents from the Weather Channel, from the Weather Service, more importantly, that's what I meant to say, National Weather Service, NOAA, where some of that data is then contextualized. So for instance, today in where we are in South Carolina, it just disappeared. There it is. Sunshine and clouds mixed and stray shower or thunderstorm is possible. Yes, we could have seen that in the graph that they provide, but there's also text that's been generated to support that. So something as simple as combining these dashboards with some descriptive text to go along with it goes a long way.
Yeah, and I think that when they're used for, like when they fit their use case, they're really powerful, especially as a tool to make sure that everyone is getting the same information within a certain scope and scale and not being distracted by other things coming in. But it's when they're used to be, when people start assuming that that's the only way that spatial data is represented, when you start to lose that cartographic element or the thematic mapping element is, and I don't know, I think the beyond the dashboard would help that, but I still don't know what it would look like, except what would bring in thematic mapping.
Well, I think I would ask Frank, in maybe what you're envisioning is what aspects of the dashboard would be carried over, right, as the, let's say, the foundation for something beyond it. And what is it about dashboards that we do think are valuable? For example, I think the synthesizing element, right, bringing together disparate, perhaps pieces of data. I mean, they would relate to a theme, or maybe they're, I think that might be the question, is that the part that gets carried over and just gets into a new form with new data, or is there something else in saying beyond the dashboard, or is it a complete break? Kind of what are you thinking in your mind as you mull this?
So I will admit that probably 60 to 80% of my thinking here was, for the topic side, is let's critique dashboards, that bit. Let's tear this down a little bit. That was a chunk of my thinking. And I fully acknowledge I don't have a good replacement, because if I did, I'd go out and make one and, be rich and famous. But I don't have a complete vision for that. However, I do think that we can, as you're saying, suggesting look at dashboards and go, okay, what do they do that's really powerful, that's really good? One of the things I think is amazing about dashboards is that you can make them so easily. And the tools that we have available to us are incredibly robust for making some very compelling looking visualizations and communications of data streams. And that, I think, is a very powerful bit. I also think that you're right. Synthesizing a lot of data points or clouds that seem to not relate to each other implicitly says you need to connect these things. These have validity. I think those are important functions of whatever comes next. The evolution beyond dashboards, that they have to be easy to construct. They have to be able to pull in all these different pieces of information and different data streams, and they need to be able to tie together into a nice, digestible visualization and mechanism. And I think we started teasing, as Jesse pointed out in the weather example, we're teasing at some of the edges of that, by adding in things. But I kind of feel like a lot of what we're doing now is, I don't want to say somewhat of an add-on. I think the weather is an interesting case because we're used to weather as qualitative, right? There's usually a guy that was on the screen at 6:27 in the evening showing, giving you verbally describing what's going to happen in your day tomorrow with weather. So we're kind of used to that a little bit. One of my concerns here is I'm like, how do we keep that understanding that so much of what we're trying to communicate does in fact have a qualitative piece that needs to be retained as a qualitative piece, that communicated well in a qualitative piece. Some of it's easy, like pictures, how do you describe a Van Gogh painting? You don't, you just show a Van Gogh painting. It's going to be much better than any description. And audible, same thing. How do you have how do I describe a song by The Clash? I don't. I just play a song by The Clash. That's just going to be a better depiction of it. But I'm not sure how we integrate that in these different data points in a meaningful way that I can quickly draw inferences between these data points. So I'm dancing around the answer to your question because I don't have a good answer to your question.
Well, I don't think we do, but I do think that when we look at these tools, because dashboards have caught on, right? Because one of the things that I think, and this is just kind of my opinion, and we did see it again in the Jesse mentioned the Johns Hopkins COVID dashboard, right? It was a crisis that a lot of people felt lost, like what's going on, and just I think people latched on to something like that to say, well, I can somehow try to make sense of it. I mean, maybe even I don't necessarily understand a lot of the stuff, but it makes me feel like I'm getting information, right, that I'm not in the dark. And it's not something happening, scary out there. I can see statistics that are showing me things. I can connect with some of the information that might help me make a decision. And I think that's part of the allure of this particular type of visualization.
Or in the context of that one, it helps me understand how scary it is. So it's not my mind running away with how much worse it could be. It was terrible, but I can now see what's going on. So it gives us information and allows us to change our psychology based on that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people want, right? They want to feel like it's an agency kind of thing. Weirdly, it's a passive visualization in some ways, right? As you pointed out, Frank, it doesn't, and Barb too, right? It doesn't synthesize the stuff for you. It just brings it in. And so in that sense, the visualization is somewhat passive. It's just feeding it and you read it, but it gives you as the user like a sense of being active in that you're going through the dashboard and you're ingesting that and then, making a conclusion based on it.
But, it also hides a lot of the nuances you need to have, right? Because, you see that and you go, okay, that's interesting. I see the lines kind of creeping upwards, and that's a good or bad thing, depending on what particular thing you're talking about. And, okay, I know how to mentally prepare myself for that this is an alteration. But, what they're not saying, because it's a star asterisk at the bottom in the footnote that you need to look at and realize, they used they used an R squared value of 0.25 for the model. So it's not really predictive in a meaningful sense in this particular phenomenon, unless that particular phenomenon is a social phenomenon, then 0.25 is actually pretty decent. And all these sort of caveats that you kind of need to have expertise to get that, these p-values and these r-squareds a little wonky, and that's why that line looks like that. Not because the what's going on the ground is that. And I think that's it's really easy to, even when you're given that information, to just not pay attention to it, or to go in your brain and go, I don't really remember what that means, so I'm just going to not pay attention. And then just look at the line go up. And that's one of the issues, I think. And I think it allows us to make the comfort decision that we're making data-driven decisions, right? And that's what's the background of most dashboards. I need to make decisions based upon good data that is defendable. And this is the best decision I can make based upon the data that I have available to me at a particular point in time. That's essentially what that is. And it doesn't mean you'll make a decision that won't be disastrous, but it does mean that you've got some comfort level that you've based this upon data. But I feel like a lot of times there's data behind the data that is just as important. What's the joke about historians? You can tell a real historian because they only pay attention to the footnotes. That's kind of the important bit. It's not just the data itself. And I feel like some of the brilliance of dashboards have kind of obscured that bit.
Well, it's a question of creator versus user, I think, in part of that conversation as well, because the creator still has access to the data. And if they're the ones who are making decisions, they still have access to that. But users are generally not necessarily as heavily involved in those heavy decisions. So is it okay if they have the more summarized data? I don't know.
Well, yeah, and I guess that goes down to purpose. And that's it, right? It's both kind of the opportunity of dashboards, but also the real challenge and the real danger of any of that type of stuff is, as almost every conversation we have that relates to, data visualization versus data analysis and all that, is that, we always are going to know that there's more to it, right? And lots of decisions are made. And that's where data literacy comes in, which is even more crucial, I think, now, as, we start to see these visualizations, or have been seeing them.
To summarize, very much for a VerySpatial podcast that's designed to think about spatial and geospatial things, I think that we're all very comfortable with the general notion that every map tells a story. I don't think that we've gotten used to the notion that every dashboard tells a story. So we as map makers, as cartographers, understand that the decisions we make influence the interpretation. We know the fact that we've included bits of data, or we've used a particular color scheme, or whatever it may be, or the scale of analysis, or any number of things that we do in our map making is going to influence this, and that the map is in fact not reality. It's an abstraction. It's of reality. I think that's something we're very comfortable with. I feel like the dashboard making world and the dashboard consuming world is not comfortable with that, even though I think they're identical. There's no difference between, in this context, in making a map and making a dashboard.
Well, and I think, just to kind of follow on that real quick, we have the fact that the map reading community isn't as comfortable with the fact that they're looking at abstraction as we are. That's
true. Yeah.
No, I was thinking what I was going to, reply to, because I agree with Sue about the data literacy, that this is also, what we keep saying, it speaks to geoliteracy. And then also, you don't know what you don't know. And so a lot of this has to do with people understanding the geographic concepts, spatial literacy, data literacy, geoethics, and all the things that might not be contained within a dashboard. Those are things that are outside it that need to be pursued or provided to the audience in some way. That maybe beyond the dashboard is that education.
And I think that to that extent, Jesse's point is very on point, that we look at a map and that's just true. It's just always true. It's on the map. It must be true. And that's the consumer side that doesn't realize, well, that doesn't necessarily be true. Just because you put a map together, you can say map says lots of terrible things. We know that as cartographers, as map makers. And I feel like the first thing that needs to happen on dashboard side is that we need to acknowledge that this is data, but it's data that's presented for specific outcomes and to send a specific narrative. And we've chosen certain visualizations and mechanisms, not to mention collected the data in certain ways, to fit that, or we've manipulated the data because it's what we had, that's just what we have, so we have to do something with it. I don't know that, and there needs to be a word for dashboard maker other than dashboard maker, the equivalent of cartographer. The dashboard makers have necessarily acknowledged that, but to that extent, we also need to communicate to the consumption side, the public, that, hey, this is one way to look at this reality. It's not the only way to look at this reality, and it has an intended audience for an intended purpose with intended limitations, and we need to communicate those, I think, a little bit better. So whatever the next dashboard looks at, I think that's a part of it, is to say this is a narrative, and it's a good narrative, and it's useful, and we do the best we can. We make an ethical narrative, but at the same time, it is a narrative. There are other narratives that we could tell using this technology.
And I think, as educators, I think of this increasingly, right, in teaching. So just in the dashboards that do include the spatial thing, the first time I put a dashboard exercise into my Intro to GIS class, and that was during COVID. And of all the things that were remarked on in feedback after that, they were most taken by that. They really were excited to actually work on that. And, again, come back to the idea that they could create something that you could see these bits of information, and the form of it, was attracted them because it was, the way professionals kind of analyze things. And so you have a lot of analogs of how these things are used in decision-making situations and things like that. So they were attracted to it, I think, in that sense. But on the other hand, right, to say that as creator of this platform, it's your responsibility to do your best to, tell people what's going into the visualization, and to understand that, once again, you were very taken by it. So imagine someone that hasn't had that experience with understanding how we construct our visualizations. So I watched it, right, the very first time. And then after that, I made sure that when I included it, that I discussed, what was happening when you were putting these, because they had a lot of misconceptions. I think it's one related to emergency management. And when, they talked about the different statistics that were actually enhancing the map, some of them had different update times. And then we, talked about, as we've talked about during this conversation, right, is that you have to be clear what each piece is contributing to the potential narrative you're putting together, right? And that's a little bit tougher, I think, with dashboards maybe, or with things like that where it's not necessarily static, right? If it's online and things are changing, it's not static. And then if you don't have that understanding of how they're changing and when, that can lead to a lot of misunderstood conclusions, I think.
Well, I was going to say, this is where I lean a little bit more heavily with Jesse, that sometimes it's misconstrued, sometimes it's purposeful, and that's the intent and the power behind the dashboard, is that people do accept them as, it looks good, so it must be true, which is something Jesse told me a long time ago when I first started looking at maps. So,
see, I darken everybody's door.
No, it's very important. It's Monmier's the, how to lie with maps, but it's, on a dashboards. So,
which I was literally just looking up to see if it had gone open source yet, but no, it's still in print. So,
I think it's kind of interesting that one of the phenomena that, again, we're familiar with, well, in GIS, not so much in geography more broadly, pet peeve of mine, but I don't see discussed at any level in dashboard construction, which is ecological fallacy. I see an awful lot of people inferring details about a finer scale based upon the summary dashboard statistics things. And I think, well, you can't do that. I can't tell you anything. I can tell you what the trends are, the overall, true of the population. I can't tell you anything about Sally Smith and John Jones. I don't know anything about them. You got to go ask them, talk to them. But that seems to happen in my experience with dashboards a little bit more so than we do even in maps. And I think that's a troubling trend that I'm running into. That could be a artifact of the place that I work, but I mean, it is very, since we do tend to work with students, we tend to, want to get down to that unit and say, well, what is this student's experience? What is this student's concern? What is this student's outcomes? And one of the challenges I find with dashboards is people are inferring a lot of things that you can't do that. You don't have that ability. we don't know if that's true or not. We have no ability to do that. And I feel like that basic message is not even in the room of discussion, much less on the table.
So it's an interpretive issue as much as it is the creation of the dashboard content issue.
Yeah, I think that one of the fears that I have with dashboards is that it gives us a lot more comfort and confidence that what we're seeing and the decisions we're making are good. When we're not acknowledging, that's the sort of the summation of all this, is that I don't feel like we acknowledge enough that there are real limitations with dashboards. There are real limitations with the data that are in dashboards. And if we don't acknowledge those on the surface, we won't necessarily reach good, however you want to define that, decisions, but we will be confident that our decisions are good. And it's not a good confidence necessarily.
Well, I would agree and add to that. I think it's not even so much that data that on the dashboard might be limited. It might be data that we've been using all along, but in other forums, we were making appropriate analysis because we whoever the experts were, did understand what it could be used for. And when it's just presented in a scenario like a dashboard, then maybe that's not there. All right, that intermediate level, the middle range level that you need to say, okay, so yes, you put on monthly statistics for county level data for something, as you say, and then this one is voting districts or something that's a subdivision, and no, they're not the same, and no, they aren't updated the same, so you can't do it. But they may have been in that form all along. It's just that now there's no intermediate level of analysis, synthesis, whatever, to prepare them to go on to the interpretive step.
Yeah, or APIs have made this even worse, right? Because with an API and, particularly with little widgets that may be in Arc or maybe in Power BI or whatever it may be, or Tableau, you can just grab a data stream and throw it in there.
I guess in my mind, now that I've heard what everyone's talking about, it's almost like there needs to be not really a metadata, something that says, no, this widget doesn't go with this widget. Or you're bringing this in, but they're using these two data streams. Are you sure you want to do this? Because and I don't know what that would be, but something almost like a thing that says, are you sure you want to bring this in?
Well, I think that in GIS, we've got a good history of this, in that even though obviously there are real problems and mistakes, we got a good history in the sense of it was hard and you had to go get a GIS person that knew what the heck GIS was and where you get data from and how you mix these tools up and where all the stupid toolbox, if you had to run this to that to the other thing. So you had a person, you go, let me train this person to do things well and ethically and think about those things and factor those in their processes. One of the challenges I think with dashboards is that anybody can grab these things and throw them together and get an incredibly, incredible product that looks amazing and professional, and you can publish on it and you can sell. And it's not hard. It's like putting Legos together, but boom, you got something without having that expertise on the back end to go, hold on, wait a minute, I really can't stick these two together because you're going to infer things that are contradictory or, whatever it may be. I don't think we have that professionalization at that level, which is a little bit of a problem.
Now we're breaking out into conversations of job titles almost. We have designer, we have data scientists, we have data analysts, we have spatial data scientists, we have cartographer, we have all of these different people who are involved in making these things. And not all of them have the same experience and knowledge of how to best put information together, let alone the fact that while some of the tools for creating these dashboards allow for a little eye for you to click on to find out about that section of the dashboard, it doesn't mean everyone is filling in that metadata or that descriptive text that says what this should be for or how it was created. So there's a lot of this mashup of just in general where we are, because cartography is the same way, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can make a map real easy now, or you could, 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago. Give somebody an ArcGIS Online account, they can put something together, and people go, well, it's on the map, must be true. And you go, no, this is garbage data. You can't make that inference. It's really easy to do.
But then going back to what you're talking about earlier, we could take the example of, and specifically talking about having the ecological fallacy maybe was the one I'm thinking of. But if we look at digital maps, we have this thing where we have very high resolution aerial imagery. We have surveyed data of buildings and other things. And a lot of times we get people who zoom in all the way in that they can and look at the two and say, oh, well, this building's data set must be off because it doesn't line up with the imagery. In reality, I'm much more confident with somebody who's gone out and surveyed the building footprints than I am with the imagery, because I know the warping and stretching that has to be done with imagery.
Or alternatively, they go on a website and they do it and they go, well,
exactly.
those lines don't map up. And you're like, well, it's WGS 84. It's Web Mercator projection on the web. Yeah, it's not gonna. I mean, it's you
well, that's it. It's just all of these, whether it's a dashboard or an online map, you have to understand, and the population doesn't understand. They're not taught this by any means. This is just a representation.
So, I wanted to broach this topic because, again, so much of what, and we could talk for literally hours, and we've been going on for a bit longer than normal as it is. I do dashboards a lot, and I feel like that a lot of the takeaway here is I feel like there's an awful lot of the things that we've experienced in this industry, in the geospatial industry, we need to apply and help our brethren doing dashboards to say, oh, we've actually kind of gone that trail a little bit, and we didn't solve the problems. We didn't fix all the problems. We didn't address all the problems. We kind of have some idea of what some blind alleys are and what some things help, and maybe approach this from this direction a little bit and do things like fill out those eyes that nobody ever fills out, that sort of stuff. So we've got some good experiences here that I think that we as an industry and as a discipline could help others to do better. And I don't think we'll get it all right this time, but hopefully when dashboards 3.0 and 4.0 and 5.0 show up, we'll get it better and better with every try.
Just two letters to throw in that I avoided using the entire time.
Probably I was about to, so you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Are the two letters A and I?
Yeah.
I just didn't want to get into it because it'd be like a whole other, but perhaps in a couple months. Yeah. So.
Because there is a lot of, capabilities with generative AI where we throw it at data and it does an interpretation. Now, there's a lot of training to be done for it to do it well, but...
Well, and also a little bit of terror on the part of any of us experts at turning something like that loose. But it's coming. So anyway.
Yeah, if you want us to add your event to a future podcast, send us an email to podcast@veryspatial.com.
If you'd like to reach us individually, I can be reached at sue@veryspatial.com.
I'm Barb at VerySpatial.com.
I'm Frank at VerySpatial.com.
I'm available at Kinda Spatial, and of course you can find all of our contact information over at veryspatial.com/contacts.
As always,
we're the folks from VerySpatial.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you in a couple weeks.